Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews and another build of a 1/72nd scale BF 109. This time it's the new Airfix starter set which a friend gave me when he came back from the UK, and in this video I'll be airbrushing it, weathering it, and also adding some 3D printed cockpit parts which I'll be putting onto my Cults page, a link to which I'll leave in the description. But for now, let's get into building this one. To start with, all of the sprues and the 3D printed parts received a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil, dirt or residue from the parts, and then I began cutting out most of the parts from the sprue, including the fuselage halves, cockpit floor, tail wheel and the wings. Once the parts were cut out using some side cutters, I then used a file and my knife to sand or cut away any excess sprue, and I used my cutters to remove the headrest that comes moulded to the fuselage. The wings were sanded and then glued together initially with Revell Contactor Professional, and then I ran some Tamiya extra thin along all of the seam lines and sat them aside to dry. I was a bit miffed that this kit does not include an instrument panel, so I ended up 3D printing one, along with a joystick which I'd add later, and some 3D printed rudder pedals which I had spare. I would have also done some side panels, but at the time of building this kit I had not actually designed any just yet. The instrument panel I created does have a slight inaccuracy however for this particular aircraft, since I designed it with the bomb selector panel fitted. I originally did this since on the box art the aircraft is depicted flying low over some burning T-34-85s in what appears to be a ground attack mission. However, I later did some research and found that the unit the kit's markings are included for only flew the 109 in a fighter role, so it's unlikely they had any aircraft with the special bomb controls and attachments actually fitted. Nevertheless, I cut the instrument panel off of its supports and glued it to the fuselage with some super glue. Once it was in place, I cut out the landing gear parts, exhausts and radiators, cleaned them up, and then attached the radiators to the lower wing halves. To prepare the parts for painting, I then sprayed several passes of Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer onto the inside of the fuselage, the wheel wells, cockpit, and the landing gear parts. The primer was then left to cure for around about 12 hours before I'd add any paint. The first paint I added to these parts was some Vallejo Model Air RLM 2 Grey for the wheel wells and the inside of the landing gear parts. I mixed 2 drops of acrylic flow improver, 1 drop of Vallejo acrylic thinners, and 2 drops of the paint, and then started spraying it in several light passes. I considered also using this colour for the cockpit as well, since E-Model 109s used it for their interiors, but I ended up going with the darker Vallejo Model Air RLM 66 Dark Grey, as I couldn't find much evidence of RLM2 on F or G Model 109s, though it would make sense to me if some early production F models still used the RLM2 for their interior colours, as they might have still had some old stock before they fully switched over. Once the RLM 66 had dried, I then picked out the details on the cockpit sidewalls and my 3D instrument panel, first off using Vallejo Model Color Flat Yellow for things like the throttle and gauge faces, followed by Vallejo Model Color RLM 24 Dark Blue for the oxygen bottles, and Vallejo Model Color Flat Black for the gauges and the fuse boxes. The raised details I'd designed onto the instrument panel were then dry brushed with Vallejo Model Color Flat White, which was also used for the raised buttons for the fuse details. Vallejo Model Color Vermilion Red was also used on the fuse details, and for additional switches and details. With the cockpit details now painted, I used some Vallejo Model Air Aluminium to dry brush some metal scratches and chipping on the raised details in the cockpit, as well as very heavily on the seat, and a little bit inside of the landing gear bay. Vallejo Model Color Saddle Brown was then dabbed onto the cushion on the gun sight, and once this and the chipping had dried, I applied some Tamiya Black Panel Accent over the cockpit sidewalls, instrument panels, and landing gear bay to highlight their details. The excess panel liner was then removed using some X20 enamel thinners, which also helps it flow more into just the recessed details, helping to highlight them. The panel liner dries pretty quickly, and once it had, I sanded the edges of the cockpit floor, as well as any remaining sprue joints on the wings. The cockpit floor was then glued to the right side of the fuselage half, along with the exhaust and tail wheel, which had to be installed before the other fuselage was added. Once in place, I joined the two fuselage halves together, and all of these parts seem to fit pretty well without much of a gap. Some bulldog clips and tape was used to hold the fuselage halves together as the glue bonded, and I glued the wings to the bottom of the fuselage while they dried. I mainly use Revell Contactor Professional as my glue of choice, but to help soften any seam lines and provide a stronger bond, I also run some Tamiya extra thin cement along the wing and fuselage joints using the applicator, much as I'd done with the wings. With the parts now fully bonded, I cut out the horizontal stabilizers, filed away the excess plastic from their attachment points and ejector pin marks, and then glued them to the fuselage. The propeller spinner, blades, base piece, pin, and the front of the fuselage where the prop gets attached to were then cut out and cleaned up next, and then the pin was inserted into the forward fuselage piece and the base of the prop hub glued to the pin. The propeller blades were then glued to the base, and then the spinner was glued on top. You could potentially leave the propeller separate from the fuselage for painting, but since the scheme I was doing would not require this, I later glued it into place. The oil cooling intake on the underside of the nose and the two halves of the supercharger inlet were then cut out, glued together, and then glued to the front of the fuselage. The final part I then added was the propeller before I could prepare the aircraft for painting. With assembly now mostly completed, I began to fill any gaps that were present on the fuselage and wings with a little bit of Vallejo water-based putty. Once I'd applied the putty, I used a damp finger to rub the excess away, and then left it to dry. After about 12 hours, I sanded away any excess putty or remaining seam lines using a file and some sandpaper, and then prepared the aircraft for painting by covering the cockpit with blue tack and the landing gear bay with the kit's included retractable landing gear options. To prepare the aircraft for painting, I sprayed several passes of Vallejo Gloss Black Primer as I had done for the cockpit, using a ratio of about 4 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver and 1 drop of Vallejo Acrylic Thinner to 5 drops of primer. I built up the primer in several layers until eventually the upper surface had a solid and uniform gloss black finish. I let the top surface of the aircraft dry for a couple of hours before then turning the model over and priming the underside using the same mix and technique. After 12 hours, the Vallejo primer was fully cured, so I began to mask the yellow Eastern Front marking bands on the wings and fuselage using some Tamiya masking tape. I then mixed up around 2 drops of Model Air Insignia White and 1 drop of Model Color Vermilion Red to create a pink base for the yellow to see if this would make it easier to apply, and surprisingly it actually did. Spraying on the Vallejo Model Air RLM 4 yellow was definitely a lot easier onto the pink, and after only about 3 light passes, the yellow was pretty solid. I gave the yellow markings a few hours to fully cure before masking them off, and then proceeding to mix up 7 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 3 drops of AK Interactive Thinners, and 7 drops of AK Interactive RLM 65. However, I didn't actually shake the paint well enough, and the paint came out too thin and very inconsistent. So after giving the paint a good shake, I mixed up the same mixture, and this time it sprayed on a lot more nicely. I applied several passes on the underside of the aircraft, generally filling in each panel, and then doing a few passes over the entire surface to make it nice and uniform. The AK paint sprayed really well with only a few small amounts of tip drying and very little speckling, though I did find it takes a bit of thinning and testing to get the mixture just right. Once the first few coats of RLM 65 had been applied, I then added 2 drops of Flow Improver, 1 drop of RLM 65 and 2 drops of Vallejo Model Air Light Gull Grey to make a more lighter and pale variation. This was then sprayed lightly onto the middle of all the panels to create some post shading and a bit of panel variation. For more extreme areas I added a bit of white and then repeated the process to get some more pale results. The painting guide showed quite a thin line of RLM 65 on the underside of the fuselage, but I still decided to paint quite high up on the fuselage sides to try and give the RLM 70 upper surfaces some variation by having a lighter base colour. And speaking of the darker upper surface, after I let the RLM 65 dry, I then masked off the areas of it I wanted to keep, using some Tamiya masking tape, before then mixing up 6 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, 1 drop of AK Interactive Thinners, and 6 drops of well-shaken AK Interactive RLM 70. Once this was mixed up, I then sprayed it onto the entire upper surface of the aircraft in the same way I'd applied the RLM 65 on the underside. I had a fair bit of trouble with tip drying using this colour, possibly since I had a slightly thicker mixture with less of the flow improver, though I've recently picked up some Vallejo retardant to see if this helps prevent tip drying with the acrylic paints. As you can see, the RLM 70 produced a pretty bland and dark surface, so I mixed in a single drop of RLM 71, which is a lighter green. I then sprayed it on the middle of the panels and a little bit more extra on certain panels to create some variation, but found that this was very subtle, so I ended up adding a few drops of Insignia White and RLM 2 Grey to the mix to get a much more pale and lighter variation. On certain panels, I sprayed the colour a lot more heavily to make them look a little bit more worn out. I also applied it thicker on the upper surface of the fuselage for some artificial shading. In the end, I was quite happy with the results I achieved, so I removed the masking tape, and unfortunately I had to do some brush painted touch-ups to the yellow bands, as for some reason some of the paint came off with the masking tape. Perhaps I needed to give the yellow a little bit longer to cure before adding the tape, as normally I don't have any issues with Tamiya tape pulling off any paint. I did consider airbrushing the yellow on, but looking at references of 109s from JG77, some had some pretty rough looking yellow bands. After a few coats of yellow, I did some touch-ups with RLM 70 to get a sharper edge between the RLM 65, and also to cover some other bits of chipped paint which seem to have also occurred. I kind of liked how it made a subtle patchy look in some areas, and in the end with the varnish and weathering applied, it wasn't very obvious. Speaking of varnish, to protect the paint from any further damage and prepare the model for decals, I then sprayed both the upper and lower surface of the model with several passes of Vallejo acrylic gloss varnish. I mixed it to a ratio of 4 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 2 drops of acrylic thinner, and 5 drops of the varnish. As well as sealing the paint, it also provides a smooth glossy surface which helps the decals adhere and also prevents silvering. I allow the gloss varnish to dry overnight and then started applying the decals. Being a starter set, you only have one scheme and virtually no common stencils. Nevertheless though, Airfix have included one fuel placard and some engine detail stencils, which is a nice addition to the roundels and markings. After a few seconds soaking in warm water, the decals were slid off the paper and applied onto the model using a brush. I also used the brush to apply some water before adding the decals onto the model to help make positioning them a little bit easier. Once in place, all the decals receive some Tamiya decal adhesive, followed by Vallejo decal softener, which both help the decals to soften and stick more to the model's surface details. The decals were pretty good, although they did seem a little bit thicker than the usual cartograph ones, and I did find that the roundels, especially the crosses, folded a little bit more. I would also suggest painting the yellow markings rather than attempting to use the decals, as I reckon it would be pretty tricky to line them up, and they're also a little bit thick. Once again, the model was set aside overnight, this time for the decals to settle, and then the next day I moved on to some detail painting. The masks for the landing gear bay were removed, and I painted the tail wheel a coat of RLM 2 Grey. The main landing gear struts, which I'd left on the sprue, were then painted RLM 65 blue on the outside to match the wings, and the antenna was painted with RLM 70 to match the fuselage. After a few more touch-ups with these colours, I painted the tyre of the tail wheel initially flat black, and then carefully painted some white markings on it, neatening up any mistakes later on with some more flat black. I've heard various reasons for the white wall tyres that appear on some 109s, ranging from them being a marker to denote that the wheels are designed to ground the aircraft and prevent static discharge, rather than the aircraft needing to be grounded via a wire when refueling. Or possibly another reason I've heard is there was a material shortage, so substitute materials were used, resulting in white tyres. But either way, White 1 of JG77 had white walls according to reference photos, so that's how I painted them. The main landing gear was glued into place, and though the fit was not super tight, after holding the wheels in place they did become solid enough to add the tyres, but I would recommend keeping the weight off the landing gear for a few hours while the glue bonds. The main wheels had been primed on the sprue using some Vallejo Gloss Black primer, so I only had to do a couple of light touch-ups using some Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black. Once this was done, I then sprayed the entire model in Vallejo Matte Varnish. This would seal and protect the decals, and give the aircraft a more accurate matte dull finish, rather than the glossy finish which it currently had. To provide a solid coverage, but prevent any build-up of the varnish while it was wet, I sprayed in several light passes back and forth. Once the upper surface had been sprayed, I let it dry for a few hours, and then applied the matte varnish in the same fashion on the underside. With that, the painting was completed, so I once again sat the aircraft aside overnight for the varnish to cure, before I'd then move on to the weathering process. With the matte varnish cured, I got out a fine brush and some Vallejo Model Air aluminium, and once I dabbed the excess wet paint from the brush, I then gently stippled it onto the aircraft to create some metal chipping. I applied it to the wing walkway area, the leading edges of the wings, the propeller blades, around moving parts such as the access hatches and engine cowlings, the landing gear, radiators, on the wheel hubs, and the edges of the canopy area. Once the aluminium had dried, I then mixed up some Vallejo Model Colour Flat White and AK Interactive RLM 70 and used a similar dry brushing method and dabbing process to create some more superficial scratches to the paint. This second layer of chipping can also be applied over some of the aluminium to make the bare metal chipping a bit more subtle. The same process was repeated on the underside of the aircraft with some flat white and RLM 65. The exhausts were then painted model colour gold in two thinned coats to act as their base colour. While the gold paint dried, I decided to peel off the blue tack that was masking the canopy area and found it had done its job well. By now the chipping had dried, so to highlight the panels, create some depth, and to create a build-up of some dirt and grime in them, I got out some Tamiya Enamel Black panel scent and applied it along all of the recess panels on the upper surface of the model painted in RLM 70 and some of the panel lines around the controls and engines on the underside. The black was a little bit too strong for the RLM 65, so for more of a lighter and dirtier effect, I switched to some brown enamel panel wash and applied it to the remaining panel lines. Once the panel washes had been applied, I let the wash dry a bit and then used a cotton bud soaked in some X20 enamel thinners to rub away the excess and soften the effect. The enamel thinners also help the wash to flow into just the gaps and can also create subtle streaks if you rub them in the direction air would flow over the aircraft while it's in flight. For the next stage of weathering, I switched to some oil paints, namely Abteilung 502 Black, Engine Grime, Flat Earth, Buff, and White. These were applied onto some cardboard and left to dry for about 2 hours to help remove the excess oil, which would help them provide a more matte finish rather than a glossy one. After this, I then started to apply some exhaust stains by mixing some AK odorless thinners to reactivate some of the dried black and dab this onto the exhausts and in a line on the fuselage heading back from the exhausts and along the wings. I also dabbed some onto the wings near where the exhaust was based on reference photos. Once the dabbing had been applied, the oil paint was then blended gently with a brush which had been dipped in the thinners. This technique was also used for engine grime and black for some stains and streaks around the landing gear and radiators, along with a trick where you can apply the thinners to the model and then use a very fine brush to draw very thin lines for streaking of various fluids such as oil or coolant. In reference images, 109 seemed to generally build up a lot of black streaks just behind the wing. My replication is probably a little bit extreme, and maybe I do need to contact Mercedes-Benz to fix an oil leak, but I think oil stains and streaks can build up very quickly even on a well-maintained aircraft, and if they aren't washed regularly, they definitely would stay. For some dirt stains and marks, I use the Flat Earth and Buff colours and apply them sparingly onto the walkway, but a little bit more heavily on the wheels, the bottom of the rudder, and the underside of the wings where dirt and mud would get flicked up by the aircraft if it was taking off from an unprepared strip, which was often the case on the Eastern Front. After some more touch-ups and blending, I then let the model's oil paints dry for a couple of days since they take a long time to dry, and in the meantime I started to cut out the canopy and its antenna. I actually lost the original kit's antenna, but luckily the WWII 109 has several spares, so I ended up taking one from that kit. A bit of light sanding was required on the canopy to remove some excess sprue, and I had to use my knife to carve out some of the plastic which was interfering with my resin instrument panel. After this was done, I then test fitted the canopy, and once I was satisfied, glued the radio antenna to it, and began painting the interior colour of the frames. I did this with 2 coats of Vallejo Model Air RLM 66 Dark Grey, using a fine brush to pick out the canopy frames. While the final coat of the RLM 66 on the canopy frames dried, I carefully picked out part of the landing gear shock and painted a base colour for the nav lights using some Model Air RLM 01 Silver. Vallejo gunmetal was then used to paint the machine guns on the cowling and prop spinner, and for the exterior colour of the canopy framework I applied 2 coats of the AK Interactive RLM 70 and left it to dry. For the nav lights, I painted over the now dry silver with some Tamiya clear red and clear green, although I made a mistake and accidentally painted the left wing light green and the right wing red, but I would later correct this. After some final touch-ups on the canopy and the antenna, I then used a cocktail stick to very carefully scratch away the paint from the clear parts of the window. One of the advantages of painting canopies with acrylics is that it's really easy to scratch them off, and with a steady hand, results can be very nice and crisp canopy frames with no masking, as long as you're gentle and don't apply too much pressure, which could cause scratches on the plastic. To add some grime on the recently painted machine gun barrels and landing gear, I applied some of the Tamiya black panel accent, and once this was done, I glued a replacement pitot tube to the left wing, which I'd knocked off much earlier in the build. For some antenna rigging, I used my normal method of AK Interactive Mega Thin rigging wire and some Deluxe Materials Rocket CA glue by gluing one of the wires to the antenna and then gently stretching it to the tail, wrapping it up slightly and gluing it into place, and then trimming away the excess. For the smaller section of wire, I glued on another piece of rigging wire to the fuselage based on reference photos, and then to the main part of the rigging wire. This process seems to get easier with practice, so I definitely swore a lot less this time compared to the last 109 I'd added rigging wire to. The pitot tube was painted RLM 70, and after a few coats of this, I then got out some RLM 01 silver to paint the unpainted tip of the pitot tube, and to repaint the nav lights in order to correct them. Previously, I'd removed the kit's included headrest, which comes moulded to the fuselage with very little details, but fortunately I had an AZ model armoured headrest spare, so I painted this up with a few coats of RLM 66. The kit also didn't come with a joystick for the cockpit, so I 3D printed one and painted it RLM 66 as well. I finally finished the nav lights and painted them correctly this time by putting the clear red on the left side and the clear green on the right side. The joystick then received some model colour flat black on the top, and for the base of the control column and the base colour of the headrest, I painted them with some model colour saddle brown. To give the headrest and base of the control column a more weathered leather look, I dry brushed them with a little bit of model colour light brown. Once it had been painted, I carefully removed the joystick from its supporting frames from when it was printed, and glued it to the cockpit floor using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. The CA glue was also used to carefully glue the headrest to the roof of the canopy since it doesn't dry and fog up clear parts, and after some minor adjustments to make sure it fitted, the canopy would finally fit into place, and with that, the Airfix 109 F-4 starter set was finally completed. And here you can see the results I achieved with this model. I'm super happy with how this one turned out, especially the paint job. While it's a perfect scheme for a beginner, being super simple, I was a bit reluctant to try this one as I feel like it could come out very bland and toy-like. But I think with the post shading, the subtle panel variations and other weathering applied, it turned out pretty great. I do of course wish I had filled out the hole for the stand, but maybe I'll still use it when making animations as a mounting point. The kit went together super well and is pretty sturdy, however I was a bit disappointed by the complete lack of details in the cockpit, which seems to be an issue with any Airfix 109 that is not their brilliant E model in this scale. Putting the rather nice pilot figure in may be one solution, but I still don't see why Airfix couldn't do a joystick, or especially an instrument panel when it's still visible. Even though this is intended to be a beginner starter model kit, I hardly see why one extra piece of plastic and a decal couldn't have been included, as even if you weren't able to do it, you could still leave it out, and it would be available for anyone comfortable with adding it. I'm certainly glad I added my 3D printed panel into place, even if it has got a bomb control panel which would probably not have been fitted to this aircraft. I've since designed a version that doesn't have it attached, and also some sidewalls, so I'll be adding that to my Colts shop, so if anyone wants they can purchase it, 3D print it and add it to your 109F or G cockpits as a little upgrade. While the Airfix 109 has some nice details and goes together great, it lacks a few finer ones such as the control balances and cockpit, and doesn't have as many decals for the common stencils either. It would be nice to see Airfix do a more advanced version of their 109F, like how they did with the Spitfire, but they haven't announced anything, so for now I would probably recommend sticking to the AZ and Edgewag 109F if you'd rather a detailed 109, but if you're still new to model making and don't mind this kit's shortcomings, or can get it for a pretty cheap price, this is a pretty good kit to start with, and I would definitely recommend it. So that completes my build of the Airfix Bf 109 F4 starter set. A lovely simple little kit to build, and definitely one I'd recommend for beginners, and with a little bit of luck Airfix might do a new tooling that's a little bit more detailed for more professional model makers. We can always hope in the new year, and speaking of which, I hope you've all had a fantastic one if you're watching this video after New Year's, and if you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel as it really helps out. And if you want to leave any friendly advice on how I can improve my build videos as well as my builds, or any experiences you've had with this kit or similar ones, then be sure to leave it down in the comments below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons who've helped not only fund me buying these kits and the products I've used and the time I spend making these videos, but have helped make all of them possible in the last year. The next build video will be on the AZ model Bf 109 F4, so that should be an interesting kit to compare. But until then, as always, take care, have a fantastic new year, and until the next one, model on.